Right, if we can bring the slides up then, Richard. As I said, my name is John. I'm one of the pastors, and we are in the second week of, I guess, what's going to be about an 8-week series that we've called Against All Odds. Now, what this series is all about, at this time of the year, we decided that we really wanted to dig into the Old Testament somewhat, the first part of the Bible. And we decided that we were going to do a series based on some of the characters that we find in the Old Testament. We've called it Against All Odds because all of the characters that we've chosen either had flaws in their character or there were serious flaws in the circumstances and situations that they found themselves in, or a combination of both, which is actually what you'll see with the person that we've chosen today. Now, the other thing is, we are not choosing Premier League quality Old Testament characters. These are kind of championship characters, if you like, because these we're not looking at the Abrahams and the Moseses, the real forefathers of the Israeli faith. We're looking at some people that you will have heard of, and you'll see as we go through them. So we're going to be looking at people like Samson and Jonah and Deborah and Rahab. And today, and last week we looked at Noah when Pete preached, but today we're going to be looking at a character called Gideon. So we're looking at a guy called Gideon. Now, if you've been around church a little bit, you've probably heard of Gideon. You'll have heard of him a little bit. If you've not been in church all that long, Gideon may even be a character that you've not particularly aware of. Now, today, I'm not going to be looking at what God achieved through Gideon particularly, and God did some amazing things, but you're going to have to look that up yourself and do your own studying if you want to read about what God actually achieved through Gideon. Today, I'm specifically looking at the call of Gideon, the way that he was called by God. Now, we read about Gideon in a book in the Old Testament called Judges. And this is a period, the story of the people of Israel, in a nutshell, is this. God created the heavens and the earth, and he created Adam and Eve. And they had various generations of kids. Mankind got really, really wicked, and God was going to wipe out mankind. And as we heard last week, he saved mankind through Noah. And as Pete pointed out last week, we're all kind of Noah's descendants, effectively, because God said he would never, ever punish the world like that again. So Noah and the animals got out of the ark, and they carried on multiplying throughout the earth. And then God raised up a man called Abraham, who was the forefather of the Jewish nation. And Abraham was given specific promises about being the father of a nation, the father of a people. Then a little bit later, God called another man. There's lots of stuff I'm missing out here, but God called another man called Moses. And through Moses, God made promises about the fact that not only would this nation, this people of Israel be a nation, but they'd also have a land. And through Moses, God made promises to Moses about them being given a land. And to this day and age, and although they had about 2,000 years out of it, we're talking about the modern state, the modern land of Israel. After that period of time, the people of Israel kind of flourished, and eventually they decided that they would like a monarchy. They would want to be ruled by kings. But before that happened, they went through many generations where there weren't any kings in Israel. They were ruled by a group of people called judges. So this period where Gideon appears, Gideon was one of the judges of Israel, and it's before the kings come. So just so you can understand the chronology of where we are. Now, what seemed to me to happen in this period, and it actually carried on when the kings were ruling Israel as well, it went a little bit like this. God's people went through cycles. They went through periods of time where they really focused on obeying God. They really seemed to put God at the center of their individual lives and the lives of their nation. They established all of the practices that God had told them to do. They obeyed the commandments that they'd been given, and they were blessed by God. And then, as the cycle ended, they fell into disobedience. they would fall into disobedience. They would start, in particular, to worship other gods, other idols, which is something God just found abhorrent. They'd fall into all types of disobedience in terms of different sins that they got involved in. And then what would happen is the favor of God would leave them, and all of a sudden they'd be attacked by other nations. They'd come under oppression, they'd suffer for a period of time, and then they would finally come back to their senses, cry out to God, and God would step in and rescue them. And that cycle repeats itself many, many, many times through the Old Testament. But when we get to this part of the story, right at the end of Judges chapter 5, we're told that the land of Israel had gone through a period of 40 years of peace. For quite a long time, they'd been really following God's rules. But that season just about came to an end. And we read about it, and all of these verses, we're going to read the whole chapter together as I preach. We're going to be looking at Judges chapter 6. So this is Judges chapter 6, verse 1. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years he gave them into the hands of the Midianites. Now, the Midianites were an adjoining nation that were really, really violent. Note that God brought the people into bondage. He gave them, in other words, he turned his back on them. He gave them into the hands of the Midianites. Because the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites, Amalekites, another nation, and other eastern peoples invaded the country. They camped on the land and ruined the crops all the way to Gaza and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep nor cattle nor donkeys. They came up with their livestock and their tents like swarms of locusts. It was impossible to count them or their camels. They invaded the land to ravage it. Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. So this is a pretty desperate picture. Israel have gone through 40 years of God's favor, and they now enter this 7-year period of being attacked from north, south, east, and west. It's really desperate. The oppression is terrible. They're swarmed over. The people that are attacking them are as countless as a swarm of locusts. They can't even count the number of camels that they've got. And it got so bad that it tells us in this scripture that all of the Israelites had actually left their homes. Things were that bad, they couldn't actually risk living in their homes. That was too dangerous. They were basically living in holes in the ground, in caves, and on the mountains. The whole nation was completely petrified and oppressed and humiliated. God had to humble them because it wasn't for 7 years of this humiliation going on. It wasn't until 7 years came to an end that they actually turned back and cried out to God. They allowed this to go on for such a long period of time. So it makes me wonder, how long do we allow ourselves to suffer before we turn and return to God and cry out to God? If you're going through something, can I ask you today, have you really got on your knees and called out to God in desperation? That's what we have to do. Verse 3 is really important because it actually says this. It says, whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples invaded the country. This is really, really disheartening. Let me just try and paint the picture for you. What was happening was that they would go out, they were living out of their own homes, but they were still trying to cultivate the land. And they were going out, they were ploughing, they were sowing, they were reaping, and all the time the Midianites and the Amalekites were watching them, and as soon as there was some food to be harvested, that was the time they got attacked. So disheartening to do all of the ploughing, sowing, reaping, harvesting, threshing, and then being robbed. It was a terrible time. Unrewarded labor, I believe, is one of life's toughest challenges. When you've worked really, really hard for something and had it snatched away from you at the last minute, that is really tough to cope with. I don't know if any of you have ever experienced that, but I tell you, it's really, really hard when that happens. It feels like you've worked for nothing. Israel's sin caused them to be robbed of absolutely everything. And that's what sin does in our lives. Sin robs us of everything if we allow it. It will rob us of the fruits of our hard labor. I do know of some men and some women, I came across some in particular in my business life, who lost everything because of sin in their lives, because they chose to follow certain paths, and sin got a hold on them. And absolutely everything I know of people that lost families, that lost homes, that lost businesses because of things that they were involved in. And sin, if we are not careful, can rob us of absolutely everything. So the Israelites had been oppressed, they'd been humiliated, they'd been robbed, they were driven out of their homes. And then, as a last resort, they turned to God. How often is prayer our last resort rather than our first resource? I did like that when I wrote it down. Let me repeat that. How often is prayer our last resort rather than our first resource? Prayer is always there for us, but so often we don't turn to the answer that's right in front of us. Let's go on through the verse. Verse 7, this is now. When the Israelites cried out to the Lord because of Midian, he sent them a prophet who said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought you up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. I rescued you from the hands of the Egyptians, and I delivered you from the hand of all your oppressors. I drove them out before you, and I gave you their land. I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not worship the gods of the Amorites in whose land you live, but you've not listened to me." Okay. Notice what God does first. The people, at long last, turn back to God and say, "Lord, save us." What does God do? He doesn't send Gideon straight away, who actually was the person he used to save them. No, God sent a prophet. He sent a prophet because, rather than a deliverer. Before the battle could be fought in the natural, there was a battle that they had to fight. Before the battle could be fought in the natural, there was a spiritual battle which had to be fought and won. That's why the prophet came before the deliverer, because we had to see the spiritual battle being won. And that's nearly always the case with us. When we've got problems, the first aspect that we need to look at is the spiritual side of things rather than the problem itself. If you're going through something difficult at the moment, could I urge you to look at it from a different perspective and say, what is God trying to teach me through this? What spiritual lessons do I need to learn? And it's only when we actually give those spiritual victories to God that he can step in and provide the natural victory. Does that make sense to you? I hope it does. So this prophet comes up and he reminds them of everything that God's done. He said, look, I've already rescued you from slavery. I've brought you out of the desert. I've driven people out of the land. I've given you their land. You're here. And all I said to you was, look, just keep following me, and you've not done it. God has to remind them to look back on what he's done for them. We need to keep looking back to the cross of Jesus. Looking back to the cross of Jesus. Constantly to remind ourselves of his power and his love and his salvation and his grace, all of the things he's done for us. We need to constantly be looking back and reminding ourselves and keeping our eyes fixed on him. They'd stopped obeying God, and very often we ourselves can be the cause of our own problems. Very often it's not that God stopped loving us, because he never does. But we've perhaps stopped loving him as much as we could. Let's carry on through this chapter. Verse 11. The angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon replied, "But if the Lord is with us, Why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when he said, did not the Lord bring us out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian. So that's the encounter. The angel comes along. In fact, when you read this in more detail, we actually realize that this angel, a lot of commentators believe, is Jesus himself. But we won't dig into that now, but there are some reasons to believe that that might be the case. It doesn't say, but they must have listened to the prophet. They dealt with the spiritual thing, and then, after the prophet had spoken to them, Gideon is called. So I believe the people listened and obeyed because Gideon's called. Now, what was Gideon doing when he was called? He was threshing in a wine press. Why? Because he was frightened of the Midianites coming and catching him. Now, let me tell you, that is not normal. That is not a normal thing to do. I'm not a farmer by any stretch of the imagination, but what I do know is this, in kind of the Old Testament times, when they gathered the harvest of the ears of wheat, there are kind of husks around the outside of the ears of wheat. And threshing basically involved being outside, ideally in a breezy or windy place, and you throw the grain in the air, the wind blows away the husks, and the grain drops back. So that is what threshing is. It's separating the husks from outside the ears of grain, okay? So you would nearly always do it outside because you need the fresh air, you need the breeze. Gideon was doing it probably underground in a wine press. It must have been a filthy, sweaty, horrible job because he was frightened. He was frightened of what might happen to him if he did it outside. Yet the angel comes to him, or Jesus comes to him and says, Gideon, you are a mighty man of God. It's almost like he should have said, Lord, can't you see what I'm doing here? Am I a mighty man of God? I'm scared to death. I'm underground. I'm doing something that's really horrible because I'm so frightened. And you're telling me I'm a mighty man of God. And Gideon's response is really, really reasonable. He actually says to God, well, if you're with us, how come all of this stuff's happening to us? How come all of this is happening to us? Verse 14. The Lord turned to him and said, go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you? Pardon me, my Lord, Gideon replied. You've seen what I'm doing here, threshing in underground. Pardon me, my Lord. How can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I'm the least in my family. The Lord answered, I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alone. Gideon felt like most of us, if we're honest. He felt weak. He felt ill-equipped. He felt he was the least of us. I'm sure Ben won't mind me saying, but I'm sure Ben feels a bit like Gideon at the moment. He's been called to go to Moldova. He doesn't speak the language. He's not been out the country very much. He doesn't know what he's going to be facing. Why have you chosen me? I'm Ben. I live on the Straits. I'm going to Moldova. There's a bit of Gideon in all of us, if we're honest, isn't there? That's something where we get called. I know for a fact when we felt the call to be involved and start this thing called Springs Church, I think every single one of the leadership team said, look, why me? Who am I? I've got nothing. How can I do this? God doesn't give Gideon a pep talk. He doesn't say, well, I'm going to send loads of people to be with you. We're going to have a fantastic worship band, and you'll actually be in Zor Church in a few years' time, and you're going to be doing all of the things that God has done for us as a church. He didn't tell us in advance. He just called us to be faithful, and that's what he did to Gideon. He didn't give Gideon a pep talk. He just said, I'm going to be with you. It's going to be all right. And perhaps that might be what you need to hear tonight. Somebody may just simply need to hear God saying to them, I see you. I know what you're going through. I know the problems you are facing. And my promise is, I am going to be there with you. I am going to be there with you. I'm not going to give you a pep talk. I'm not going to tell you you're going to be strong and brave and things are going to be fine. I'm just simply saying to you, I will be there with you. And that is all we need. We don't need self-confidence. We need God confidence. Gideon replied, this is verse 17, "If now I have found favor in your eyes, please give me a sign that it's really you talking to me. Please don't go away until I come back and bring my offering and set it before you." And the Lord said, "I'll wait until you return." So Gideon went inside, he prepared a young goat, and from an ephah of flour he made bread without yeast. Putting the meat in a basket and its broth in a pot, he brought them out and offered them to the Lord under the oak. So Gideon goes off and prepares a quick, tasty snack. The angel of the Lord said to him, "Take the meat and the bread and place them on this rock and pour out the broth." So Gideon did so. Then the angel of the Lord touched the meat and the unleavened bread with the tip of the staff that was in his hand. Fire flared from the rock, consuming the meat and the bread, and the angel of the Lord disappeared. When Gideon realized it was the angel of the Lord, he exclaimed, "Alas, sovereign Lord, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." This is the first sign Gideon received. Many times when we read the story of Gideon, we kind of gloss over this. But the first sign that he had was that he prepared a meal for his visitor, who was God himself, and God actually, through his staff, accepted the burnt offering, if you like, of the meal. There was a miracle there. The first of Gideon's signs was this. Now, it's quite reasonable, if God calls you to do something, to ask for confirmation. In fact, I would say to you, if God's called you to do something, it would almost be foolish not to seek confirmation. God doesn't mind us saying, "Lord, I think this is what you're saying to me. Could you just confirm this?" And very often, if you're being called to do something, God will speak to you perhaps in your own prayer life. And then before you know it, you get a scripture confirming something to you. Or somebody else comes up to you completely out of the blue and just gives you a confirmation. God gives confirmation. Now, Gideon was actually being called to lead Israel into battle. It was a big thing he was being called to do. Sometimes it's fine to ask for signs. Gideon recognizes it is God, and straight away he's given his first task. Verse 23. But the Lord said to him, "Peace, don't be afraid. You're not going to die even though you've seen me." So Gideon built an altar to the Lord there and called it "The Lord is Peace." To this day it stands in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. That same night, this is Gideon's first task, the Lord said to Gideon, "Take the second bull from your father's herd, the one 7 years old." That would be a choice one, 7 years old, just at its prime. "Tear down your father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole beside it." So Gideon's dad had actually built one of these abominations that God found something in their own home. They had something that God found absolutely abhorrent, an altar to Baal and an Asherah pole in his own house. Take that rubbish out of your own house is what God's saying to Gideon there. Verse 26, "Then build a proper kind of altar to the Lord your God on the top of this height. Using the wood of the Asherah pole that you cut down, offer the second bull as a burnt offering." So Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord told him. But because he was afraid of his family and the townspeople, he did it at night rather than in the daytime. In the morning, when the people of the town got up, there was Baal's altar demolished, with the Asherah pole beside it cut down, and the second bull sacrificed on the newly built altar. I think that's a great verse. They woke up and, wow, this has all happened overnight. Verse 29, they asked each other, "Who did this?" When they carefully investigated, they were told, "Gideon, son of Joash, did this." The people of the town demanded of Joash, that's Gideon's dad, "Bring out your son. He must die, because he's broken down Baal's altar and cut down the Asherah pole beside it." But Joash replied to the hostile crowd around him, "Are you going to plead Baal's cause? Are you trying to save him? Whoever fights for him shall be put to death by morning. If Baal really is a god, he can defend himself when someone breaks down his altar." So because Gideon broke down Baal's altar, they gave him the name Jerubbaal that day, saying, "Let Baal contend with him." Now all the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples joined forces, crossed over the Jordan, and camped in the valley of Jezreel. So they were being attacked again. Then the Spirit of the Lord came on Gideon. He blew a trumpet, summoning the Abiezrites to follow him. He sent messengers throughout Manasseh, calling them to arms, and also into Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, so that they too went up to meet him. So this is Gideon's first test. God says, "I'm called you," and this could apply to many of us. The work starts close to home. Before you can go out, put your own house in order first. Cut down this altar. Smash it up. Only when you deal with what the problems are in your own home, in your own locality, are you equipped to go out and do bigger things. So he did it at night because he was frightened. He was frightened of the people. He was frightened of his own dad. But he did it. He did what he was told to do. And because he was obedient, he gets some really surprising outcomes. The first thing is this. His dad actually supports him. He was frightened of his dad, but his dad actually said, son, yeah, I'm not going to let anybody attack you. He gets a new name. He's called Jerubbaal. He then also gets filled with the Holy Spirit because he's obeyed God. He blows a trumpet and he summons a mighty army. In fact, because the army was so great that Gideon summoned, God wasn't actually able to use it. You've got to read the next chapter if you want to read about that. But he commands such a mighty army that God says, there's far too many people here for people to realize it's me that's going to get the victory for you. We haven't got time to go into that tonight. But even after Gideon's seen all of that, he's been filled with the Spirit, he still has doubts. We're just bringing this into land now. Verse 36. Gideon said to God, if you will save Israel by my hand, as you've promised, look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you said. And that's what happened. Gideon rose early the next day. He squeezed the fleece and wrung out the dew, a bowl full of water. Then Gideon said to God, don't be angry with me, but could I make just one more request? Allow me one more time, one more test with this fleece, please. But this time, make the fleece dry and let the ground be covered with dew. That night, God did so. Only the fleece was dry, all the ground was covered with dew. Gideon actually asks for a second and also a third sign. He had the first sign, which was fine. He asked for a second and a third sign. He starts by saying to God, if you will save Israel by my hand, as you've promised. In other words, he's saying, if you're not lying to me, God, if you're not lying to me, give me some more signs. You've probably heard the expression, putting a fleece out. That's where this comes from. That's what the expression means. So he does this daft thing, really, where he puts a fleece out, and one time the fleece is wet and the ground's dry, and the next time it's the other way around. Asking for a second and a third sign is undoubtedly weak faith. It's weak faith, but it's still faith. And Jesus said, we only need faith the size of the seed of a mustard grain to move a mountain. We don't need a lot of faith. Gideon had weak faith, but it was still what God could use. And God will take whatever faith you can offer him and actually use it remarkably. One of the biggest questions that we ask ourselves, and as pastors and trying to provide pastoral support, one of the big questions that people often come to ask myself and Pete about is this: how can I know the will of God in my life? People will often come and say, I think God might be saying this to me. And there's a lot of fear involved and apprehension, and people agonize over seeking the will of God. And this is what Gideon was doing. He was actually saying, look, I think I've heard from you, Lord, but can I have a first sign? Can I have a second sign? Can I have a third sign? And in this case, God was prepared to allow Gideon those three signs. That doesn't mean he'll always give us three. Sometimes God won't show us too much. Sometimes we will ask God for a sign, and actually, if he gave it us, it would be too much for us to cope with, either good or bad. God might be calling us to something that's so challenging that if we could see the whole picture, we'd never, ever dare start the journey. And he's just calling us to trust him and believe one day, one step at a time. Things may be really rocky ahead of us. And if God allowed us to see that, we'd just quit. Or it could be that God's going to bless us in such an amazing way that if he actually told us in advance, we'd become arrogant and cocky and we wouldn't even think that we needed God. God knows what we need to know, and that's all we need to accept. And sometimes when we're seeking the will of God, the answer is this: just don't stress over it. I've just got 2 more verses, if you could bring them up, Rich, that I want to share with you and leave you with this. This is from Romans chapter 12, a fantastic letter that Paul wrote to the church at Rome. And he wrote this to them: "Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." And then, this is the key to it, then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. If we do what Paul says, offer our bodies as a living sacrifice, surrender ourselves to God in worship, if we don't allow ourselves to be conforming to the world, but actually step aside and allow God to transform us by renewing our mind, when we get to that place, then we will be able to test and approve and know what God's good, pleasing, and perfect will for us is. We need to live one day at a time to prove the good and acceptable will of God. Gideon was dictating his terms to God, wasn't he? Jump through this hoop, then jump through that hoop, so I know that I can trust you. Gideon didn't keep his word to God. He said, if you just do this, I'll follow you. And then when God did what he asked, he said, well, could I ask just one more proof, please? How merciful was God? Gideon had a tremendous challenge ahead of him. Gideon's faith was weak, but it was real. There's a letter in the New Testament called the letter to the Hebrews, the church in Jerusalem people think it's written to. And one of the chapters is a list of all the men and women of incredible faith in the history of Israel. And the writer to the Hebrews writes, remember Abraham, remember Moses. He also says, remember Gideon. Gideon appears in the list of the mighty men of faith. Even though his faith was weak, it was real. And I just want to leave you with this. Please really hear this. Weak faith in a mighty God can accomplish great things. Let me just repeat that. Weak faith in a mighty God can accomplish great things. So that's Gideon. Certainly a flawed character, a guy that had the cheek to ask God for signs, a guy that felt weak and hopeless and ineffective, and yet God did use him powerfully and mightily. And we can all, I believe, relate to that. I think we're going to close with a song, if the band could come back. Thanks so much for listening. I know that was quite a long message because it was a long chapter and I couldn't really cut any of that story out for you. So I hope you've been able to keep up with it. And I'd urge you to read the next couple of chapters in Judges because God does some amazing things through Gideon. But just remember that call of God. And if God is speaking to anyone tonight, if you're seeking to know the will of God, if you're feeling that God's called you to something but you feel weak or unable to do it, please just have a chat with one of us afterwards. Anybody here, we'd love nothing more than to just pray with you, to encourage you, to help you seek out what God's will for your life is. But if you're feeling absolutely weak and useless, let me tell you that's probably the best place you could possibly be in for God to use you. Thanks so much for listening. Thank you.